Welcome back to another video, audio nerds, and it's time to return to the world of Chi-Fi as we take a look at these, the Moondrop Starfields, which are another pair of IEMs that, like the KZ, ZSN, Pro X's, few that we looked at recently, have also had their fair share of hype in the audio community. Now, Moondrop are a Chi-Fi company who make a dizzying array of IEMs ranging from the Moondrop nameless earbuds at 22 quid, which are clearly so cheap that they couldn't be bothered even to think of a funky name for them, to the over £1,000 soulless IEMs. Now these, the Starfields, definitely sit towards the more budget end of the range, although they're certainly not cheap, and at around £100 they represent a big step up in price from the ZSNs. But are they worth it? Well, let's take a look. So first of all, inside this rather large box, needlessly large I'd say, we get the IEMs themselves along with their interesting cable, which we'll look at in a minute. You also get quite a nice carry case actually, a plastic bag containing some spare ear tips in various sizes and some replacement wax filters. But most intriguingly, we also get this rather huge pair of tweezers, which I think is to change the ear tips, but would also serve quite nicely to pluck my rather bushy eyebrows with. So we'll get rid of those for the moment. The carrying case feels quite nice and is pretty sturdy, although it's not very big, so you'll have to really carefully stuff the IEMs back in. But once it's closed, you see what I mean? There we go. Once it's closed, it will not take up too much space in your bag or your pocket. The IEMs are themselves made of metal with quite a nifty blue paint job, but alas, look at this, despite using them really carefully for the last 9 months or so, the paint has started to chip, revealing the silver metal underneath, and I think that's really disappointing, and as you can see, it really detracts from the otherwise premium look and feel of the otherwise beautiful design. Nevertheless, the earpieces themselves are pretty light, and with their triangular shape they fit really nicely in my ears using the medium tips. The included cable, I'm sure, will divide opinion. So the main bit of the cable is this rather loosely braided blue material, although I have to say that it hasn't unraveled in any way. The bits of cable leading up to the IEMs themselves are even thinner, although more tightly braided, but thankfully they terminate in a 2-pin plug, so it should be fairly easy to get a replacement. Now, there is some plastic reinforcing the bits that hook over your ears, but it's not too stiff and actually feels quite comfortable as these things go. Overall, I've found the cable to remain, on the whole, tangle-free. Okay, time to get to the all-important sound bit of the review then. And you would be expecting a significant uplift in quality over these ZSN X Pros for the extra 80 quid. Remember, I thought that these were absolutely brilliant and rather special for £20. So, how do the Starfields compare? Well, they are good, really good. They're a single dynamic driver mechanism, although Moondrop employs what they call a carbon nanotube. To me, it sounds like it's time to fire up the phase inverters and the tachyon chamber, Captain. Remember, dynamic driver earphones tend to have slightly better bass response than balanced armature setups, but they tend not to be able to pull the insane level of detail in the mid-range and treble that you get with balanced armatures. Well, as ever, let's take a quick look at the graphs first, this time courtesy of our good mate Crinical. You can see that there is a slight bass uplift to give some impact and extension, but the mid-range is pretty close to the neutral target here, and then there's that slight lift in the high treble range again, presumably to give an increased sense of space and air. But as always, the proof of IEM quality is in actually listening to them rather than looking at graphs. Graphs can be really misleading. So I put these through a really tough test using some of my favourite tracks that I know really well. So we got going with some Spongle, and if you haven't heard that, it's truly mind-bending electronic psychedelia kind of world music. Really hard to classify actually, but it's a real hard test for less able IEMs. We then hit them with some female vocals in the form of Sarah McLachlan and Lana Del Rey. Now, whatever you think of Lana and her ill-advised Instagram antics, you can't deny the brilliance of her last two albums. Fantastic. We then shifted gear into my favourite genre, 90s alternative rock, baby, with Nirvana and Soundgarden, for example. And then we came back down to earth gently with some Niels Fram. And do you know what? The highest compliment I can pay to the Starfields is that I enjoyed everything I listened to through them. In fact, I forgot that I was meant to be doing a review. I was enjoying the music so much. And there's nothing about the sound of these Starfields that I can imagine anyone finding offensive or fatiguing. If I had to use one word for them, I would say smooth. So yes, the bass is warm and defined. It's never overbearing, and there's a requisite amount of fun factor in the lower bass register. Now that's toned down a bit in the higher bass region before we hit the mid-range, meaning that there's no bass bleed at all. Don't worry about that. The bass has real decent impact, but these are by no means overpowering bass monsters. The mid-range is, as you'd expect, solid and pretty realistic, and the timbre of most of the mid-range instruments and vocals, particularly female vocals, is pleasing and really decently textured. The mid-range blends really smoothly into the treble, and there's no hint of shoutiness or sibilance that you sometimes get. That slight bump to the higher treble range does give an impression of some slight airiness at the top of the audible spectrum that nicely counterbalances the bass. Now, I wouldn't describe these as the most detailed or revealing of IEMs, and they're definitely on the warmer side, so you will need to bear that in mind when pairing them with a source and an amp. So for example, a warm amp like the Hip DAC might be a bit too much for some people in terms of warmth overall. However, with a more neutral amp or even a slightly bright one, like for example the Dragonfly Red, I think these sound absolutely brilliant for the price. Engaging, fun, and detailed enough to give a real insight into your favourite music. Now, if I had to criticise the sound in one way, it would be the soundstage, which is not the widest, and particularly the centre image is very much in the middle of your head. You don't get that lovely out-of-head experience. Imaging, however, is not too bad, albeit 2D rather than 3D. It's quite easy to pick out the various instruments in the mix. Soundstage is something that most IEMs at this price range do struggle with, however, so I think it's going to be a bit harsh to criticise them too much. Overall, I do think that the Starfields represent a solid upgrade over the still fabulous, mind you, ZS-NX Pros, and overall they present a more balanced sound. Sonically, overall, I'd describe these as well suited to most genres of music. They're a real jack of all trades and will please most people. I think the only people that might be a bit disappointed are people who love oodles of detail and also people who like a very bright sound signature. You might want to look elsewhere. But these are, in essence, a lot like the IEM versions of HD 650s, which is obviously high praise indeed. They represent the mid-range really nicely with just enough bass and just enough treble sparkle to make them really pleasing without being fatiguing. Overall, I'm going to give them an Audio Fixation Silver Award. Now, why don't they get the Gold Award, you might ask? I mean, certainly sonically they're pushing into lower gold territory, if you like, but I think the build quality for £100 could be better. I'm really not happy with the chipping. If the paint job had been perfect, then they would have been a clear gold, but as they are, silver. So take that as you will, and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. It's always great to hear from you. Hope you enjoyed that review, and watch out for more coming up soon.